Donald Trump just suffered two back-to-back public humiliations, first by China on the world stage, and then by a reporter who confronted Trump about that humiliation by China, prompting Trump to have a meltdown on camera. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, Donald Trump is a glutton for punishment. We're going to dive into this article, but just to set the stage, here's the first humiliation. Trump says the United States and China are actively discussing tariffs. Beijing says that's false. So Trump says one thing, guys, don't worry about it. We're making a deal with China. Things are going along. It's the art of the deal. It's negotiation. And China's like, nah, that ain't happening. That's not happening. Public humiliation number one. We'll dive deeper into it after I play this clip for you, which is public humiliation number two. Donald Trump being asked about it in the White House by reporters. And he doesn't like the question and doesn't handle it well.
Mr. President,
but thank you very much for that question. I like that question. Yeah, please.
A question on China. Can you clarify with whom the U.S. is speaking with China? They're saying it's fake news that trade talks are happening.
Well, they had a meeting this morning, so I can't tell you. It doesn't matter who they is. We may reveal it later, but they had meetings this morning, and we've been meeting with China. And so I think you have, Jeff, as usual, I think you have your reporting wrong. Thank you very much. We'll see you. We'll see you in.
So he just shut down the entire conversation, lashing out at the reporter. Per usual, Jeff. You just got it wrong, Jeff. No, I'm not going to give you any information, Jeff. Everyone, we're done. Thank you. Get out of here. Pathetic. This guy cannot handle a critical, important question, no matter how justified or good faith. He just can't handle it. So let's dive into the first humiliation, which predicated the whole thing. Trump says the U.S. and China are actively discussing tariffs. Beijing says that's false. Global concern is growing amid a U.S.-China standoff over high tariff levels that amount to a mutual trade embargo between the world's two largest economies. Let's dive deeper. Okay. China on Thursday directly contradicted Donald Trump's claims that Beijing and Washington are actively discussing resolutions to a trade war that threatens to upend the global economy. While Trump said Wednesday that the world's two largest economies are actively talking, a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson responded that, quote, China and the U.S. have not engaged in any consultations or negotiations regarding tariffs, let alone reached an agreement. The spokesperson, and I'm going to butcher their name, so I'm just going to say the spokesperson, made the comments at a briefing in Beijing saying that reports of ongoing talks were false. He added that while China is open to negotiations, quote, if it's a fight, we will fight to the end. At 145%, Trump's tariffs are higher on China than any other country. As he ratcheted up tariffs on Chinese goods in recent weeks, citing unfair trade practices, Beijing has responded in kind, bringing its total tariff on U.S. goods to 125%, levels that amount to a mutual trade embargo. And I also want to point out, as I've said before, this is important, people who say that China is guilty of unfair trade practices, they're right. Especially when it comes to the theft of intellectual property, China has not been a good faith trading partner. That is undeniable. That does not justify what Donald Trump is doing now. Just want to point that out. The prospect has raised fears of a global recession, sending markets whipsawing as trade tensions have done the same. Relations briefly appeared to improve Wednesday after the Trump administration signaled that it was discussing reducing tariffs with China. Still, Trump and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent gave conflicting accounts of the state of negotiations Wednesday, with Bessent saying, quote, both sides are waiting to speak to the other, without providing further detail. The secretary reiterated remarks he made the previous day, predicting near-term de-escalation. Quote, I don't think either side believes that the current tariff levels are sustainable, so I would not be surprised if they went down in a mutual way, he told reporters in Washington. Trump, meanwhile, has said, quote, everybody wants to be part of what we're doing, and that the U.S. and China had direct contact on trade, quote, every day. A senior administration official told NBC News on Wednesday that the U.S. is speaking with China on tariffs, but at a low level that has not involved cabinet officials. The mixed messaging came a day after Trump made comments that were interpreted as a potential softening toward Beijing. Rather than playing hardball with China, the U.S. is, quote, going to be very nice, and the final tariffs, quote, will not be anywhere near the current 145%, Trump told reporters Tuesday. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt denied Trump was softening his tone, telling Fox News, quote, there will be no unilateral reduction in tariffs against China. And we'll talk about that in a moment, by the way. Those comments poured cold water on U.S. stocks, which paired earlier gains Wednesday and slipped in pre-market trading Thursday. Asian markets ended Thursday mixed, while European indices fell in early trading. The suggestion that tariffs could soon come down, quote, reflects the pain that these tariffs have imposed and are likely to impose on U.S. businesses and U.S. customers if continued, said Lee Brandstetter, a professor of economics and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Talking about tariff reductions before winning any concessions from China or even starting serious talks looks like a climb down, Brandstetter said. Quote, that to me is consistent with the view that Trump did not really think through the consequence of his tariffs decision, he added. Quote, they've now become much more evident to him. The impasse between the U.S. and China is causing growing anxiety as implications become clearer. This week, the International Monetary Fund slashed growth forecasts for the U.S., China, and most other countries, citing the effects of U.S. tariffs. The White House is increasingly concerned about possible shortages on U.S. retail shelves as orders begin for the holiday season at the end of the year. A spokesperson for Hapag-Lloyd, a German container shipping group, said Thursday that its customers had canceled 30% of shipments to the United States from China over concern about their trade dispute. After a similar battle over tariffs in Trump's first term, China, which has long been preparing for a second trade war with Trump, has not rushed to offer concessions or set up meetings with U.S. trade officials. Quote, we don't care about what he wants, said a government advisor serving in China's foreign ministry and professor at Fudan University in Shanghai. The U.S. and China may exchange some information at the working level, but that's not negotiation, he said. Trump just wants to send reassuring signals to the domestic market, suggesting that the Chinese are talking to us, don't worry. But that's not the case, Wu said. In the meantime, China faces its own pressures, including a slowdown in its export-driven economy that would only be made worse by tariffs. If domestic demand doesn't pick up to compensate for the drop in exports, China may need to negotiate, senior economist for Nestidis in Hong Kong. It's quite hard to convince the rising Chinese middle class to once again accept a decline in their living standards, he said. Other factors, such as the fact that Chinese President Xi Jinping doesn't have to answer to voters, may buy China some more time. And again, this is where we're to come back to what China is able to potentially endure. Quote, I think the Chinese have taken the measure of Donald Trump, Brandstetter said. They've determined that he really can't afford the economic and political cost that high tariffs, even on China alone, would generate, and that he would fold pretty quickly if pushed. That seems exactly what's happening. So again, that's embarrassing. That's humiliating. Hell yeah, we're guys, don't worry about it. We're in talks with China. And China's like, no, we're not. It's like, go on hanging out with a bunch of people. Oh, this is my girlfriend, Susie. And Susie's like, what the hell are you talking about? I don't know you. That sort of thing. Pretty embarrassing. Now let's get into, I guess two things here I want to point out. So the first thing is, Trump indicating that he was going to roll back the tariffs, right? Or as a prelude to some sort of negotiation. And Scott Bessent at various points, the Treasury Secretary, has suggested some of the same thing. China is telling Trump the same thing. If you want to talk about trade, if you want to re-examine our trade relationship, then you got to cancel these tariffs. You got to end the tariffs first, then we'll talk trade. Okay. Caroline Levitt and others are saying, no, what Trump means is that he'll reduce the tariffs, but after negotiation. That's what he meant, even though he kind of suggested otherwise. So it's all over the place. But China is saying, no, if you want a trade deal, a new trade deal, a re-examined trade deal, you got to kill the tariffs first. So getting to the end of the first article that we read about the pressure that Trump faces domestically versus China, let's look at that. The conservative Wall Street Journal. Again, Xi is ratcheting up China's pain threshold for a long fight with Trump. Censorship and surveillance have held the Communist Party in control and are getting stronger. Okay. The bullet points. China has been strengthening authoritarian tools to prepare for a confrontation with the United States. Xi Jinping has consolidated powers to levels unseen since Mao, focusing on stability amid trade tensions. China is using AI and surveillance to preempt dissent, showing resilience despite economic pressures. Okay? So, let's look at it. As Trump tries to play hardball in his trade war with Xi Jinping, he faces an adversary who has armed China to play a long and potentially painful game in its contest with the U.S. In the weeks since Trump first slapped sky-high tariffs on China, Beijing has responded with defiance. A spokeswoman for China's foreign ministry posted on X footage of 1953 of Mao Zedong promising to fight to the end against U.S.-led forces in the Korean War. Quote, "We are Chinese," she wrote. "We don't back down." The Mao Post and other messages from Beijing highlight what China sees as one of its core advantages against the U.S. While Trump and his Republican backers are vulnerable to the whims of American voters, the party that Mao built is deeply entrenched, having maintained power through more than 7 decades, despite war, famine, political upheaval, and financial crises. Xi isn't resting on those laurels. Since an earlier trade war during the first Trump administration, he has intensified his grip on the country's leadership and spent lavishly reinforcing the authoritarian tools that underpin the party's longevity, including enhancement of the world's most sophisticated systems for censorship and surveillance. The Chinese leader wants to harden his country specifically for a confrontation with the U.S., urging officials to engage in what he calls extreme scenario thinking. Trump has already struck more than a conciliatory tone this week, saying he wants to enter negotiations with Beijing and is willing to lower the 145% tariffs he's imposed on China in his second term. The White House hasn't said what it ultimately hopes to achieve in negotiations with China. Any push to significantly reduce the U.S.'s $295 billion trade deficit would require China to fundamentally change its economic model. In Xi, Trump is facing off with an equally pugilistic figure. Before he even took power, Xi swiped at, quote, foreigners with full bellies and nothing better to do who had the temerity to criticize China. He's repeatedly stated his belief that the age of American dominance is nearing its end, due in large part to the capitalistic excesses of the very consumer-driven economy the U.S. hopes to foist on China. Where the Trump administration is riven with factions and embraces chaos, Xi has focused on stability. He eliminated term limits in 2018 and has used an endless crackdown on corruption to centralize power to a greater degree than any leader since Mao. He's packed the party's senior leadership with officials experienced in propaganda and security who've made it a priority to inoculate China against the risk of mass dissent. Quote, Chinese society has an incredibly high capacity for pain, said a professor of global economics at the MIT Sloan School of Management and author of the forthcoming Statism with Chinese Characteristics. Quote, there is one scenario in which stability breaks down, and this is the scenario in which there's a serious split among top leaders, as happened in 1989, Wang said, referring to the internal party divisions over that year's pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square. China is now further away from such a rupture than at any other time since the start of the post-Mao reform in 1978, according to Wang. To be sure, the Trump administration can inflict real pain on China, which is heavily dependent on exports for growth. The country's debt-laden economy grew by 5% in 2024, according to official figures, though that number has its skeptics. At the start of the earlier China-U.S. trade-off during Trump's first term, it was closer to 7%. By some estimates, the Trump tariffs could wipe out more than half of Chinese exports to the U.S. Economists at Goldman Sachs estimate that as many as 20 million workers in China are exposed to U.S. exports. Quote, no political system and no political leader could emerge unscathed by the tariffs of the dimension proposed by Trump if they go ahead in a sustained fashion, said Richard McGregor, a China expert at the Lowy Institute, an Australian think tank. Factories will close and many thousands of people will lose their jobs with little in way of a welfare system to fall back on. Workers are the biggest driver of dissent in China, accounting for more than 40% of in-person and online protests across the country in the first 3 quarters of 2024, according to a tracking by China Dissent Monitor, a project of the U.S.-based nonprofit Freedom House. Some of the messages aimed at rallying the country for a trade fight have been met with skepticism on Chinese social media sites, suggesting that the party could face pushback if the economy were to suffer significantly. Xi says he worries that China's young people are unwilling to suffer for the good of their country in the same ways of previous generations. Let's see. If similar discontent were to boil up as a result of the trade war, the party can turn to a mix of responses, including fiscal stimulus, targeted subsidies for affected industries, and even direct handouts to laid-off workers. It can also wield the vast sustainability maintenance machinery for the party built to raise the political system's pain threshold after the Tiananmen crackdown, which has ballooned in size and sophistication under Xi. That system includes human and AI-powered censorship and surveillance networks designed to preempt dissent, backed up by an army of police and domestic security agents. So it goes on and on and on like this about all the sorts of things that China can and will do to try to enhance China's pain threshold in the event of a full-blown sustained maximalist trade war with the United States. So, quote, the reason they've spent all this time building up these systems is precisely for the situation they're facing now, says Jessica Botke, a former U.S. State Department intelligence analyst, now serving as a senior editor at China File, an online magazine run by the New York-based nonprofit Asian Society. So, to be clear, as we've said before, a trade war hurts both sides. A trade war between the 2 biggest economies would hurt both sides. But the consensus seems to be that the domestic security that Donald Trump has, again, in terms of the polling and backlash from the American people, make him significantly more vulnerable, and it would be significantly more painful for Trump than compared to somebody like Xi Jinping. And that's yet another reason why we probably shouldn't have a full-blown trade war with China. Food for thought. But Regardless, they have nonetheless humiliated Trump anyway by saying that the supposed talks that they're in is total bullshit and Trump is lying. We'll see what happens. But in the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.